Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the third and final panel of the Transforming the Nonprofit Sector Conference. Panel 3 is called The Research You Didn't Know You Could Do. It's a somewhat patronizing title, of course, because you do know quite a bit about some forms of these research, participatory research, design thinking. But I would lay my bets that you know less about arts-based research. But we've specifically curated this panel to highlight research you hadn't quite considered much of. The previous two panels were about evaluations, about randomized control trials, systematic reviews, and you feel intimidated by those forms of research. There are actually other forms of research you can consider doing. These are more accessible, probably things you can already do. So arts-based approaches highlight the unique value and possible worth of artistic modalities in generating data or arriving at insights that can inform your programs. And while this is of special interest, of course, to the arts organizations, I think non-arts nonprofits might resonate with some of these creative approaches. We're very pleased to have Dr. Patricia Levy, and I actually have a book right here. There's a handbook of arts-based research that she edited. Just to give you a sense of what's in here, there are literary genres, narrative inquiry, autoethnography, fiction-based writing, poetic inquiry. There are performative genres of what you can do. You can do ethnodrama, ethnotheater, visual arts, drawing and painting research, and the list goes on. So we'll hear from Patricia later. We are also particularly interested in doing research collaboratively with the communities that nonprofits serve. So typically we think of clients or communities as the data and we study them, but much can be learned if you also tap into their experiences and strengths and contribute insights that otherwise might not be arrived at. And so we are very pleased that Professor Sarah Banks, the chair in Applied Social Sciences and co-director of the Center for Social Justice and Community Action from Durham University, is here with us. And our last speaker is Mr. Elias Teo from the School of X, Design Council Singapore. So designers always have to have very fancy names, right? So School of X, cannot just call the design lab. We'll ask him why it's called School of X later. And I think particularly nonprofits can engage in solutioning forms of research rather than just understanding the needs or merely evaluating the solutions. And design-based research really is the R&D work the nonprofit sector can do that can catalyze many innovative ways of addressing social problems. So we'll hear from Elias. Then we have two discussants, Hannah Al-Haddad, who's adjunct research fellow in IPS, and she's a big fan of both arts-based research and participatory forms of research, and Madam Muzayana Hamza, Assistant Director of Social Development from MUIS, and she herself has led a design project that IPS supported, so we'll be very keen to hear from them. So without further ado, can I pass the stage to Patricia? Over to you, Patricia.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. And I would like to thank all the conference organizers for all of their work putting this event together and for the invitation. And I absolutely want to echo what you said in your introduction, that anybody can do arts-based research. So whatever sector you're working in, whether it's social services or education, it doesn't matter what area you're in. Arts-based research is something that's available to you if it's of interest. So my presentation today is called Arts-Based Research, Promise and Perils, and I will be focusing more on the promise because I know that arts-based research is probably new to many of you joining us. So I'm going to emphasize the strengths and how you might use it. So the next slide, please. I just wanted to give you a little bit about my background. I should start by telling you that I grew up absolutely loving the arts. And I've loved the arts my entire life. I was involved with dance classes. I was in theater company. I was always involved in creative writing. My mother is a painter, so I was exposed to many different art forms. My entire childhood loved art, but I always saw it as a leisure time activity. And when I became a sociologist and I became a professor, I didn't see any way that art would be a part of my work for a long time. That being said, I am now a sociologist and I have studied women's lives for many, many years, their relationships, gender identity, body image issues, a range of topics around women's lives. And ultimately, after years of being frustrated doing traditional sociological research, I did turn back to my first passion, which is the arts. And now I write novels based on my research. And in this presentation, I'm going to tell you about arts-based research and how I came to write novels based on my research and suggest ways that you might consider turning to the arts in your work. Next slide, please. So I was a sociologist doing interview research on women for many years, and I was sharing my research findings in the traditional ways I was taught. So I was writing academic journal articles, I was writing research reports, I was presenting my work at conferences, and I started to really wonder about academic writing. And my first question was, who reads it? And the reality is that there's a highly limited audience. Mostly academic writing is read by your academic peers. And this is for a couple of obvious reasons. First of all, there's prohibitive jargon. So most people outside of academia or outside of a research discipline can't understand research reports. Most people in the public cannot understand research reports. On top of that, they circulate in limited venues. So research reports circulate in university libraries, in peer-reviewed journals, which are very costly and most people don't have access to, and they circulate in research reports in private institutions, community-based organizations, and so forth, and they're totally inaccessible to anybody outside of those areas. And academic articles in the social sciences and humanities typically have an audience of 3 to 8 readers. So I just want to emphasize 3 to 8 readers. So they're not even well read within the academy. Other researchers aren't even reading these things as much as we might hope they are or think they are. So I really started to question the way I was doing my research. When I'm doing all of this work, I'm collecting information about women's lives that might be of use to others. And it seems like just about nobody would have access to it or be able to read it. The next slide, please. My next question about academic writing was, is it any good? So no, a lot of people aren't reading it, but is it any good anyway? And I came to the conclusion that academic writing is often stale and dry. And I include my own work in that, my traditional academic work. It's just the nature of the format in which we need to write and present our ideas. The essence of the stories doesn't always come through. So we can learn a lot from our research participants or our community partners, and the heart of what we've learned doesn't necessarily come through in the article, in the research report, or in the conference presentation. So ultimately, I really became frustrated with traditional ways of sharing the stories I had learned, as well as the cumulative insights I had into my research, which I had no place to put, and this led me to arts-based research. Next slide, please. So what is arts-based research? Arts-based research practices are methodological tools that adapt the tenets of the creative arts in order to address research questions in engaged ways. They can be used for data generation, analysis, and representation, or as the entire method of inquiry. So again, you're using the arts in your research practice, and you might be using it in one phase of the research, so just developing the data, just doing analysis, just representing the data, or you might be using it for the entire research project. And arts-based research can be used in any discipline or any field of study. And Justin Lee was kind enough to mention the Handbook of Arts-Based Research. And if you do take a look at it, you'll see that there are people in education, the social sciences, the hard sciences, in social work, in just about every field who have done arts-based research, health studies, I could go on and on. So it doesn't matter what your background is, this is something that's available to you. And arts-based research is a little bit different than some other forms of research. It requires researchers to think conceptually, symbolically, metaphorically, and thematically, and it requires us to use intuition, creativity, and flexibility. And sometimes that's the opposite of the traditional research approaches we've used, which require us to use a very systematic approach, very rigid approach, linear, where we follow steps. Arts-based research is different. It can be a messier process, a more organic process, in which we are using intuition, creativity, we're being malleable to the new insights we're learning, and we might be changing our project as we're going. Next slide, please. So what art forms are available to you if you're doing arts-based research? And the short answer is you can turn to any art form. So arts-based practices draw on literary, performative, and visual arts genres. So here I've listed just a few examples, which I will go over, but if you can think of an art form, it could be adapted in an arts-based research project. So representational forms include, but are not limited to, short stories, novels, novellas, experimental writing forms, graphic novels, comics, poems, parables, collages, paintings, drawings, sculpture, 3D art, quilts, needlework, performance scripts, theatrical performances, dance, films, songs, and musical scores. And I just want to stop and give you a few examples of what this might look like in practice and things that you might consider. And I know that the next presentation is going to be on participatory approaches to research. And I just want to note that there are participatory approaches to arts-based research too. So that is something that's also available. So for a couple of examples, in visual arts, there's one method called photo voice. And photo voice is when you have your research participants take photographs of something in their lives that is what your study is about. So something that you're dictating. And they take photographs, and those photographs become the data that you use in your study. So you might give them specific directions of how many photographs to take, when to take them. You may or may not ask them to also write a diary based on those photographs, but sometimes you're just asking them to visually document something about their circumstances or their lives. And then that becomes a part of your data, and it can also be a part of the way that you represent the entire study. So you might use those photographs in the final representation of your work, which also leads me to the point that you can represent your work with arts-based research in more than one way. So for example, if you do a photo voice study, you might write a journal article or a research report about it, but you might also have a visual art display in a community center or some area in which you can invite relevant stakeholders. So there might be more than one outcome to the work. For another example, we'll take something from the performative genre. Let's take ethnodrama, which was mentioned in the introduction. So ethnodrama is when you do research. It could be interview research, observational research like field research, focus groups, oral history research. You do some kind of research and you transform that into a play. So you write a script based on your research. So instead of writing just a research report, you can transform the participants into characters and write a play, which the script might serve as the final representation, or it might be performed. And you can invite relevant stakeholders to the performance to experience it and to learn from that data. Another way of using performative arts would be what's called play building. And this is more participatory. This is when you get together with relevant stakeholders, with your research participants, and you collaboratively design a play. And it's very improv based. So this doesn't have to be like professional theater. It's a learning exercise. It's a way of using drama to develop data. So you might bring in newspaper clippings relevant to your topic. You might bring in magazine articles. You might have the different participants bring in photographs, photo albums, or just share a story from their personal life about the topic that you're studying. And out of this experience, you might build and act out together a play. And then you could even tack on another component to that and then have a debriefing where you do interviews or focus groups with everyone about what did they learn from dramatizing these experiences? How did it change the way they think about these experiences, if it did? These are just a couple of examples, and I'm going to give more from my own work in a little while, but I just want to get you thinking about the various kinds of art forms you can use and how you might work with your participants or community partners in order to develop data or to represent that data. The next slide, please. So some of the strengths of arts-based research for facilitating research goals. In other words, why would you do arts-based research instead of using a more traditional approach to research? And these are just a few of what I perceive as the great strengths that I thought might be relevant to you. One is sensitively portraying the complexity of lived experience. Human life and our interactions with others and our connections with others in groups and organizations are complicated. What it means to live a life is complicated. Our workplace experiences, our educational experiences, our healthcare experiences, these are all complicated things that are very difficult to represent with their multidimensionality in a traditional research report. And when we turn to an arts form, the arts are, generally speaking, much more emotional, evocative, provocative, and we can really get at the essence of the stories that we're trying to share and share those stories in their multidimensionality so that we can portray people and their circumstances with the actual complexity of their lives. Another strength for arts-based research is promoting empathy and reflection. And I would encourage you just to think from your own life. If you've gone to a movie recently, or you've watched a movie on television, or you've read a novel, if you've done any of these things and you had feelings for the characters, you developed some empathy for the characters, something in the storyline resonated with you, it might have made you nostalgic about something, or reflect on something in your own life, or reflect on something in the culture and the society. If you saw a movie that made you reflect on some larger issue. This is a normal experience of engaging with the arts. That the arts, when we like them, when we enjoy them, when we're engaged in them, they can promote empathy and reflection because we come to care about characters, we come to see people in different ways, we come to experiences that we might not personally have. So for example, if you read a historical novel, you are reading about people that are from a different time and likely a different place and having a different set of experiences. But through reading that novel, if the characters resonate with you, it's like you're mentally walking in their shoes. That's the feeling that you might have. And so that promotes empathy for people that might be different than you, might have a different life experience than you. And it promotes reflection about the different experiences that people have had. Another strength of arts-based research is forging macro-micro links. As a sociologist, I'm particularly interested in this, and I think it's of interest most likely to folks in social services and related fields as well, that what is the relationship between our individual lives and the larger context in which we live those lives, the institutional and cultural context in which we live our lives. And the arts are uniquely well suited for crystallizing those connections. Another strength of arts-based research is disrupting stereotypes or dominant ideologies. Oftentimes, if we are sharing a conference presentation or reading a research report, we might already have strong ideas about whatever the topic is, and we might be in a mindset where we're apt to reinforce our ideas, defend those ideas. But when we experience a piece of art, it can disrupt that, and it can jar us into seeing or thinking about something differently than we might otherwise. So for example, giving a lecture about racism in the United States. A lot of people, particularly if I was giving such a lecture in the United States, would already have very strong feelings based on their personal experiences, their belief systems, the media they consume. However, if I show images, if I show visual art, depicting scenes of race and racism in the United States. That is disrupting, that is jarring, and it forces people to think and contemplate in a different way. And this is just one of many examples. Finally, and what I think would be particularly of use to all of you, is that arts-based research is accessible to the public. You can make arts-based research available to multiple audiences. So you can figure out who are the relevant stakeholders for what you're trying to achieve. And through the arts, you can reach them. And you don't have the same barriers that you have with academic writing, for example, where you have educational barriers and other barriers. Often in the arts, you don't even have language barriers in some art forms, in music, in dance, in visual art. The arts are accessible to people with different educational backgrounds. The arts are accessible to people of different ages. For example, there's so much research in the sphere of education about young people, about students, and that research never reaches students. It's totally inaccessible to them, which has always fascinated me. So if you're doing research in schools at any age level, art is actually a way of sharing that research with those relevant stakeholders, including those students. And that's really a unique strength of arts-based research. Next slide, please. So I just want to very briefly give you a little bit of the science of art. I think that most people know from their personal experience that we do experience art differently than we experience nonfiction, for example. But there's actually a lot of science behind this. I'm going to talk about literature, but there is science to support this about all different art forms. So literary neuroscience is a field that examines how literature impacts our brains. And I'll just give you a couple quick examples. Natalie Phillips led a team that showed that reading Jane Austen novels engages the entire brain, including regions associated with touch, allowing us to get immersed in what we are reading. So literally, if you are immersed in a novel you're reading, there's something physiological happening, which is why sometimes when people are really into a good book they're reading, they feel like the house could burn down and they wouldn't even notice. There's actually something happening, and there are parts of our brain that are engaged that are not engaged when we read nonfiction prose. There was another study published in the journal Brain Connectivity in 2013 by Gregory Burns and a team of researchers that suggested there's heightened connectivity in our brains for days after reading a novel. So the effects last for days. Next slide, please. So based on my frustration with traditional ways of doing research, and based on everything I had learned about arts-based research and how our brains process art, I turned to the arts in my own work more than 10 years ago. And I began with my debut novel, Low Fat Love. And in essence, I took what I had learned through my research for approximately a decade, and I wrote this novel. And Low Fat Love explores women settling in life and love, unhealthy relationship patterns, self-esteem issues, and toxic popular culture. And I just recently released Low Fat Love 10th anniversary edition to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the book. Next slide, please. What I really want to talk about is the response to this novel, because it absolutely changed my life. Now, I just want to give you a little background. When this novel came out, I had already written many nonfiction books. I don't know how many, probably 10 or 12 at that point. And I had published many, many articles and done many conference presentations. So I was very familiar with sharing my work and putting it out there. But I had never done that in an art form before. And the response to Low Fat Love absolutely blew my mind. I was bombarded by readers emailing me and seeking me out at book events, conferences, and in university hallways to tell me their own stories of low fat love. The novel became a springboard for people to reflect on and share their own relationship and identity stories, often very emotional and personal stories. People would share stories of childhood abuse, of domestic abuse, of alcoholism, of depression, suicide attempts, body image struggles, very, very personal, intimate things regularly. And I can tell you that over 10 years later, I still get emails about this novel on a regular basis, which is one of the reasons I chose to put out the 10th anniversary edition. And what I realized is, and I don't particularly think it's a great novel either. So if any of you are wondering about that, it's okay. I did the best I could. But a mediocre piece of art is much more powerful than a great research report. And that is really what I learned. And that's part of the message I want to give you. And you don't have to have some talent already. You can develop that as you go. And readers would say things to me like, you made me care about regular people, you wrote my life, because it resonated with them. I can tell you in the dozen nonfiction books and many articles I'd written, I never received responses like that. So this is something that's available to you through an art form that's not available in other ways. Next slide, please. So I continued writing novels, and today I've written more than a dozen novels, as well as a collection of short stories, all based on my research experiences. So recently I wrote a novel called Shooting Stars, which explores how love in all forms helps people heal from past trauma and abuse. And what's great about it is that people in the public read these novels because they're able to, they have access to it. So women, like the kind of women I've interviewed for my entire adult life, are able to read these novels. But on top of that, they're actually used in a range of courses. Social workers have been using Shooting Stars in their courses to teach their students about the lifelong effects of trauma and abuse. So there can be multiple outcomes for doing this kind of work. And I'm going to close by just telling you in brief that there are great rewards for doing this kind of work, which I could speak about for hours. And during the Q&A, I would be happy to talk more about that. But there are also challenges I want to address. So the next slide, please. So the promise and perils of arts-based research. So starting with the promises. So critical storytelling, sharing stories that may otherwise be invisible. So sharing the complexity of people's lives and experiences. Deep engagement and lasting learning, which there's even neuroscience to support, although I don't think we need it, because I think we've all had experience with art throughout our lives that show us that a piece of art can make a long-lasting impression. Public scholarship, reaching diverse stakeholders. So how do you reach people like those that you aim to serve? How do you reach people beyond your participants or community partners? The arts are a way that you can do that. And I do want to acknowledge that despite the many advantages of arts-based research, this work can be misunderstood or undervalued by those unfamiliar with it. So it can be difficult to secure funding for this research. So for those of you whose research relies on funding, I want to make you aware of that. And I do have some strategies, which I'm happy to talk about during the Q&A if people have questions. One option is to do a mixed methods project where you do a traditional research project and you add an arts component to that project. And that is one way that people have been able to get funding for this kind of work. But we can talk about them more if people are interested. What I really want to close on is that my experience shows me that the rewards far outweigh the challenges, and this is the truth. And I say it everywhere that I'm fortunate to be invited to speak. Turning to the arts absolutely transformed my work. It transformed the way I see all research. I talk to scholars and community-based workers around the world who have turned to the arts in their own work, and they say the same thing, that the rewards are just tremendous. I do believe that if we do work that engages us and touches our own hearts, it is much more likely to have an impact on others. And that's what the arts provide. So finally, I just want to share a few references. Next slide, please. So for people who are interested, these are the references, and I'm sure my slides will be made available to anybody who asks. And the next slide, please. Finally, this is just my website for people who are interested. There's only so much in a short presentation you can cover about a huge field like arts-based research, but you're welcome to visit my website and to contact me. And I do have a few books I would love to recommend for people who are interested in learning more about arts-based research. So I'll share those during the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Patricia. I would really prefer to read a novel than a journal article. And this brings to mind the different worlds that we're in. In the previous panel, we had Howard White, the CEO of Campbell Collaboration, telling us that he reads systematic reviews and finds out that, oh, turmeric is good for, anti-inflammation. And then he reads that and then he practices it on his life. And I don't know how accessible that would be for everyone else. But it's so great that now we have a variety of sources of information and approaches that we can consider. I would like to invite next Professor Sarah Banks to talk to us about doing research with communities. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I'm coming to you from Durham University, UK, in the northeast of England. Let me just get the slides going. And this is, it was wonderful to hear Patricia. Thank you very much for that very inspiring talk. I haven't moved on to novels, but you've given me an idea. So there we go. And you'll notice that on the front of this slide, there is quite a lot of arts-based work going on. And as Patricia mentioned, most arts-based methods are very appropriate for doing collaborative research with communities, which is the theme of my talk today. So what is co-produced research? We'll just go through that briefly. I'll then say a little bit about what it means to do co-produced research with communities, some of the reasons for doing it and some of the challenges, and then I'll give 2 examples from my own research. So co-produced research is research that's undertaken collaboratively by people from different settings and backgrounds. Usually this involves people with lived experience of the issue being researched. And one of the examples I'll give is research that was done with people experiencing high levels of debt. You could do research with people experiencing homelessness, young people with mental health issues, a whole range of different experiences. So people with lived experience working alongside researchers and or practitioners from universities and from NGOs or NPOs in your language in Singapore. Often the focus is on achieving social change. So the project on debt was about trying to challenge some of the exploitative loan companies and to get changes in the law to limit the interest rates. If you were doing research with people who are homeless, then it might be on improving services for the homeless. And it's based on ethical principles of equity, democracy, and valuing diverse contributions. So the process of the research should be as democratic as possible. It's not always possible for everybody to have an equal role, but everybody's role should be valued. And what about co-producing research with communities? This word community in the English language, as you probably know, can mean all things to all peoples. And a very generic definition of community is a collectivity of people with some, but not necessarily all, characteristics in common. So young people living in a particular neighborhood, young people who are deaf, people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual. So groups who have something in common to do with the place they live in, the identity or the interests that they have. But having said that, there can be diversity and conflict both within and between communities. And I think all people working in the non-profit sector are very, very used to working with diversity and conflict. So this is work that you would do very, very easily because you already know how to work with groups in communities, I think. And these communities can be as exclusive and oppressive as they are inclusive and caring. We often think of community as being quite homogenous, and we work with a community group in order to improve their lives. But within that group, there can be different, divergent and conflicting views. And one of the main skills, I think, of co-producing research is that skill of working with diversity and even with conflict, which I know in the non-profit sector, you have a lot of that skill base. So why do co-produced research? It could be a lot easier, couldn't it? If you want to do some research on the needs of homeless people or how people get into debt and how they can get out of debt, why not just hire a university researcher? Why not just hire an independent researcher? Or why not do it yourself as members of staff of a non-profit organisation? Why go to all the trouble of engaging a whole load of other people who probably don't know how to do research in the process? Well, it can be part of an ideological commitment to participation, that belief that we should involve people who are experiencing social issues in looking to what can be done to change the circumstances and to achieve social justice and social change. And also diverse perspectives contribute, I think, to a better research design, to broader interpretation of the findings, probably to wider dissemination to different audiences. So if we have people who have lived experience of the issue under study, then they can help us ask better research questions. They can pinpoint what the key issues are for them. Also, of course, it builds capacity in communities, which is what you're often trying to do in the non-profit sector. This will give some new skills in terms of handling information, collecting data, analysis, dissemination, and so that can build confidence and expertise in communities, which is all good. It can be a way of accessing what's sometimes called hard to reach or easily ignored participants. So if you're working on a research project to do with homelessness, sex workers, drug users, if you have a group of peer researchers who are from that community, they can perhaps reach more easily and do interviews, discussions with, arts-based projects with people who are also experiencing the same problem, which I, perhaps as an academic, might be regarded with great suspicion. It can improve the implementation of research into practice. If a non-profit organisation has got involved in doing the research, you can then use the findings immediately to improve your own services or to lobby the relevant politicians or policymakers. And finally, certainly in the UK, there is quite a strong push to engage communities in thinking about the kind of services they need and how things can be improved. And there's also a push for measuring the impact of the non-profit sector and the university sector. And I think you've heard quite a lot about evaluation in some of the previous sessions you've had at this conference. So it's community engagement is quite high on the agenda in the UK, and I'll be interested to hear if it is the same in Singapore. But what are some of the challenges? It takes a lot of time and effort to build trust, partnerships, and to handle power differences. Training may be needed. We can't assume that people in debt or people with experience of homelessness necessarily know how to do interviews, collect data, analyze it. So there needs to be a slow process of training. Academics don't necessarily know what it's like to work with homeless people or people in debt, or what the NPOs might be doing. So academics may need some training and support, and same with the NPOs in terms of research methods and design. Often the research design changes along the way. The process of doing co-produced research could be described as messy, and that's messy in a positive rather than a negative way, because mess is what you get when you have a whole range of diverse people coming together, all bringing in their own ideas, and it may take time to decide what research design will be the best. This isn't good for the university research ethics committees, who always like you to give your design at the start and to predict what will happen. But co-produced research is, in fact, unpredictable. There's quite a lot of potential for misunderstanding and for raising unrealistic expectations. We may start out to do some research on debt with a view to changing policies, but that may not work. We may produce some findings, but we may not be able to influence the politicians. So we have to be aware that research doesn't always make a difference. We hope it will, but it doesn't always. There's quite a lot of blurring of boundaries between researcher and research. So people in debt doing research with other people in debt will sometimes be a researcher gaining information, doing interviews, but sometimes they will be the researcher giving their own information, adding their data to the pool of data. And for an academic like me, I would also find myself becoming an activist. If we're trying to change policies and practice, then I may have to go to a public meeting, I may have to stand up and declare what side I'm on. There are also quite complex issues, which there are in all forms of research with people, but particularly in this sort of research, about how you can maintain the anonymity of the people who give the data, their privacy and confidentiality. Because if some of the community-based researchers are the neighbours of the people they're researching, then they would have to understand that they shouldn't reveal any information to their friends and family, that the data needs to be stored carefully, password protected, all that kind of thing. We've mentioned conflict before, and democratic representation, that tricky issue when people start to dominate, when you get what we call the usual suspects coming forward and taking a lead. How do you engage people who wouldn't normally get involved in any community activities, let alone research? The institutional ethical review processes can be complex, and that's partly because of this last point. Some people don't believe that co-produced research is particularly credible or valid. How can it be that ordinary community members who are experiencing debt problems or homelessness could actually do valid and reliable research? And that's an issue that we have to convince policymakers about. We have to stress the benefits of lived experience, but we also have to explain very carefully our research methods and show that it can be valid and credible. I'm now just going to give you two very brief examples of projects that I've been involved with, and I won't go into much detail, but you can read about them if you click onto the websites, which are at the end of the slide. So the first one is the one I mentioned already about people who are experiencing high levels of debt in the Teesside area of northeast England. That's just south of Durham. And this was a 2-year action research project funded by a charitable foundation. It was a partnership between Thrive Teesside, which is a small community-based organisation working in the area, Church Action on Poverty, which is a national campaigning non-profit organisation, and the centre where I work at Durham University, where we do research in partnership with community organisations. And our focus was on high interest loans and unmanageable debt in poor households. Thrive, the community organisation, had noticed there was some exploitative loan companies operating in the area. People were taking out very high levels of debt that they couldn't afford to repay. This was impacting their mental health, and it was thought that something should be done about this, both to stop the poor practices of the loan companies, which were really exploiting the most vulnerable people and encourage them to take out loans which were unaffordable, but also to look at the legal framework, because at that time there was no limit on the amount of interest or the costs that would be attached to taking out loans. So people could be finding they were having an annual percentage rate of 40%, 100% or more of the loans they'd taken out. So we worked with local people who were trained up to do household interviews, who were trained up to offer some mentoring. So it's all very well going in and finding out about people's levels of debt, which often they hadn't got properly sorted out. They weren't fully aware of what loans they'd got, when they had to be paid back. They needed some mentoring and support. We couldn't just go in, take the data and go away again. So we had a mentoring scheme, which involved people volunteering to provide support to help people sort out their debt. And we had community campaigns. Once we got the findings, which showed how it was people got into debt, what could be done to help them out of it, we then had some campaigns for change. And in terms of the impact, I distinguish 3 types of impact. The first I call participatory impact, which links to that idea of capacity building that I mentioned earlier. Simply by doing research together to get this diverse group of people, which would be the households, the core research partners, the community mentors, and an advisory group that we had as well, which had advice agencies, housing agencies involved. All these people were involved in working together to design, plan, and do the research. So they learned quite a lot about how to do research, what it was like to be in debt, what might work. So particularly the community mentors and researchers gained a lot of skills and confidence and felt more empowered through this process. What I call collaborative impact is focused more on the findings than on the process. So even if we hadn't got any good findings, the process of doing the work together would still have had an impact on the people involved. But the findings actually showed how it was that people got into debt, what could be done to change things. And this actually changed attitudes and thinking about how to work with people in debt. And it changed the policies and the practices of Thrive, Church Action on Poverty, the university, local councils, advice agencies. So local councils, for example, local government, could see in detail how people were getting into debt. And so they were deciding now to put in more support services. They wanted to change some of their policies and practices. The advice agencies realized they couldn't just sit in their office and wait for people who wanted help to come to them. They needed to go out and set up community-based projects. And finally, collective impact, which you may be familiar with in the nonprofit sector because it's quite a big theme now, which is specific targeted change where a range of diverse agencies and groups work together to try to shift a big issue in society. And in terms of collective impact, we did have an impact on reforming the practice of particular loan companies who had been offering very unclear agreements with people. They'd been exploiting people. They'd been having very aggressive collection policies. They would go around once a week and knock on people's doors and demand repayments. And we also had a campaign with various other organisations and members of parliament to get the government to regulate what was called high cost short-term credit. So that was the kind of loan which was one of the worst loans, and I don't know if you have them in Singapore, where you might take out a loan for a month, say $100 for a month, and if you paid it back within a month, you might then pay back $110. So you just paid $10 extra. However, if you couldn't pay it back at the end of the month, it would roll over to the next month. The next month you'd be charged fees and the interest would accumulate. So we actually, in the end, a whole group of people presented evidence and there was a change in the law and the interest rates were capped on these types of loans. And before I stop, I'll just spend a couple of minutes to talk about Imagine, connecting communities through research. You can see here, this was actually quite an arts-based project and we did quite a few exhibitions as well as films and other types of arts-based project. It was had a focus on civic participation. That is how people participate in their own communities and in terms of getting involved in changing policies, practices, improving the places where they live. And we were looking at the past, present, and future. It's part of a bigger project. And the project that I and my partners were involved in was in the northeast of England, to ex-industrial areas that had declined from the 1970s, from being involved in shipbuilding, heavy industry, armaments production, in the Newcastle area of northeast England. And we engaged with 12 community organisations, and these were youth organisations, organisations for older people, a whole range of different community centres and organisations, each one of which did their own research project connected with civic participation on the past, present, and future. And Durham University did more traditional social research, doing interviews, looking at statistics, the history of regeneration and community development from the 1970s. And finally, the most important part was a co-inquiry action research group. And that was a group involving the community organisations, the university researcher, and we would meet together every 3 months to actually look at what we were doing and plan future research, future activities, process the findings together. And just to give you an example, here's just three projects, just so you could see the kind of things we were doing. And they look very like community projects. You might say, what's the difference between doing a normal community-based just project as opposed to research? The difference is really in the intention and the fact that we were collecting findings and using them for a bigger project. So we had a family and community history project where people researched their own area. We had a community-led oral history project, which was looking at an area where there had been riots in the 1990s. It was a very stigmatized area. And in this group, they were trying to challenge the stigma of the area. And the final one was an arts-based project. It was about graffiti art in public areas where some older graffiti artists and young people worked on a project together, learning from each other and recording what they did. And this was then all brought together in a whole range of different findings. And the impact here, the participatory impact for the community organisations, it helped them to develop ideas and practices through seeing the bigger picture. It was interesting. There were two projects, one in Newcastle and one in North Shields, two parts to this, and some of them had not connected with each other before. They could see the history, the impact of the declining industry, of the politics, and they could engage in dialogue with academics and politicians who we brought in, people from the local government, to look at what was going on. And finally, the collaborative and collective impact, the national and local government officials and politicians gained new insights and understandings about how communities work, what further resources and funding they need, what are the barriers to civic engagement, and what is the value of co-production. And we did a lot of different types of dissemination and engagement, both written and through exhibitions, films, booklets, and workshops. And hopefully you'll get the slides at the end of the conference. And if you want to follow up any of these issues, you can find the links there. So thank you very much. That's the end of the talk.
Thank you, Professor Sherbanks. I really resonate with what you said. And in fact, we did a I did a participatory research project with people with disabilities, and all the challenges you said were there. We had to train people with disabilities to do interviews and because they were not research trained. And so while that was painful, the benefits were that now these researchers could access their own communities. The people who were hearing impaired could communicate with their own communities and have their own conversations and bring the data back. And so that was powerful in many ways. I would like to move on to Mr. Elias Teo to talk about design research. And I think design research in some parts would already be participatory, especially in the prototyping phase, but it can also, I suppose the question is how participatory are all these things? It can be fully participatory even in the agenda setting and all that, or just participatory in certain parts of it. But over to you, Elias, to tell us more about design research.
Thank you, Justin. And thank you for inviting me to share a little bit more. So let me pull up my slides. Yep, so today I just have a couple of slides to share with you guys a little bit about what design research looks like in practice, what School of X teaches about design research to the participants that go through our programs. And I'd like to start out maybe actually with a fun little exercise, right? Whoever is willing, just play along. And how might we actually tackle a challenge, say about littering? So, cigarette butts, number one debris item that litters coastlines and cities everywhere. I think here's what most people would usually think to do. Do more of the same. Put out more litter bins, educate people, slap on some nice messages, to hopefully catch people's attention, to do their part. Maybe even threaten people. And I think those of us in Singapore will be familiar with this. Perhaps even force people. Draw yellow boxes, set up rules, and just ask people, right, to behave better. So I think despite maybe applying some of these more rational or logical lines of trying to solve a challenge, sometimes it can still feel frustrating when people still don't do what we hope they would do. I think the thing is really that human beings are not logical creatures. And human beings tend to make emotional decisions more than logical ones sometimes. Whoever has ever invested in a beautiful bag rather than buying an alternative, reliable, non-branded alternative knows what I mean. And really a lot of our decisions sometimes are influenced to a greater or lesser degree by emotion and not just facts or the obvious. And sometimes we also make decisions subconsciously too, whether it's driving home on autopilot. And I think today I'd like to share with you guys a little bit more about how sometimes we might need to also factor a little bit more into the decision-making environment of people, where they're coming from, where they're going to, what they might be experiencing, and what's on their minds, what they feel. And to design solutions that work, it can be these areas that we might want to look into a little bit more because it involves human beings. And a different approach to problem solving is really what design research can achieve. So here, in response to the earlier challenge, ballot bin, which would you choose, flying or invisibility? And here's another one, who would you vote for? So I disagree, by the way, but that's not a discussion for today. And so the thing is, when people drop their cigarette butts on the floor, sometimes it's not intentional, it's just in their behavior, and it's because they're on autopilot. And that problem or that challenge is something that if we deploy a more innovative approach to interrupting the autopilot mode, then that's something that will change behavior. So, and the way to get there, sometimes we believe that it's really about being more empathetic in how we do research into a challenge or a problem that helps us to understand that we are not our users or our beneficiaries. So design research, in another way of saying, it's really an empathy-based approach towards user research. And as a starting point, it's about really helping us to understand different perspectives from different people that we're dealing with around a challenge. So recently I was preparing for a project to tackle the challenge of impending loss of social connections because of a neighborhood that was about to be demolished. And there had been a lot of news coverage about how these displaced residents had a lot of negative impacts about the loss of social connections and their communities. So there was one Tuesday afternoon, however, that I was sitting at the food center near this neighborhood that was about to be demolished. And I saw the village chief of that neighborhood. And I decided to just have an open user research, an open chat conversation with her. And very quickly, I actually discovered that she actually was excited to be moving to her new neighborhood, together with a few other residents. And she was saying, like, I'm so old already, but I get to enjoy new flats, right, by the Housing Development Board, and I even get to have a view of the beautiful city and the Marina Bay Sands in Singapore. So then immediately, by just having an open conversation, my mind was open to a new perspective about the challenge that I had set out to tackle. So being more empathetic and open in our research would help us to reduce the inherent bias and assumptions we sometimes bring to a situation. And the other part about conducting empathy-based design research is to really let it help us frame a challenge a lot more sharper, and so we can achieve a more desirable impact. So very often we start out tackling a problem with a certain understanding of what the challenge or the problem or the issue is. But going through a process to help us be a little bit more empathetic will actually help us better understand the context of the problem, the root causes of a problem, the motivations, the jobs to be done, and even the aspirations of people. And here's one way that we let our participants kind of frame a challenge before they even embark on a design research project, to answer these questions and to be mindful that they can always return to and refine the answers to these questions while conducting user research. That's a little bit more empathetic. So human-centered empathetic design research is a tool that we use to help people connect the dots between a challenge and its desired successful outcomes. By really getting in and understanding people's pain points and motivations around an issue. So very often we start out thinking we know what we need to build, what's the problem that needs to be solved. But very often, actually, sometimes our beneficiaries would really just have been happy with just a bicycle. surveys, data collection, academic studies, these kinds of information are great. And we start out a project being informed by this expert literature, but they rarely tell us the full story. So that's where we bring people through an empathy-based design research process to complement all these other data points that they might have around a challenge. I mean, in particular, surveys are a very popular tool. I think it makes logical sense to run surveys, especially can be done online and at mass and at scale, and it's easily conducted. However, a survey will rarely uncover unexpected insights unless we have carried out deeper human-centered research beforehand. So certain things like observational research, conversational research, shadowing, even remote ethnographic research can really allow us to notice and pick up subconscious actions and reactions of our stakeholders that we can then go on to delve in on interesting angles and ask, why do you do that? Or how did that make you feel, right? And even conduct other forms of research to really scale and further validate these deep insights that we've uncovered. For example, where do you store your clothes? I think it's hard to describe and gain insights from a survey with some drop-down questions. IKEA, right, as an organization, they conducted design research, and then they really understood that actually people keep their clothes, on a chair in their bedroom, draped over the side of a laundry basket, and really in more unexpected places than a traditional furniture manufacturer might think when they go about building a wardrobe. So there are different techniques of research that allow us to uncover different depths of insight. And there is a time and place for both broader and more deeper types of research to be conducted. And what people say, think, do, use, feel, or believe, and dream is often uncovered accordingly from more classical approaches to perhaps more empathy-based, iterative, and generative types of research. Surveys, again, are often most useful if they are designed after conducting a bit of empathy-based research. So I'd like to share a few more examples actually on what design research looks like in practice from the School of X. And it starts out for us about bringing our participants onto the ground and really being freshly attuned to and having their hearts and minds open and curious to their beneficiaries, to their stakeholders, and just really consciously keeping inherent biases away. Be on the ground, be open, be curious, ask open-ended questions, not binary yes-no types of survey questions with a limited drop-down selection of options that the organization feels they can do to solve a problem. And even crafting questions to ask a diverse perspective of stakeholders in the whole ecosystem around that problem, beneficiaries, caregivers, service providers, asking them about their experiences, the friction points, and even what they are trying to gain from their engagement with a service. And there are ways that we can elaborate a little bit further during the Q&A or in the breakout sessions around how design research can be conducted experientially, conversationally, and remotely with technology. And really, it's about helping people to just be fully immersed, enriched, and ready to synthesize new insights that could be opportunities for solving problems. I think here's a way, here's a little clip to show you how design research looks and feels like in action. Conducted by some public service officers and their island partners of the beach, Sentosa Development Corporation, and beach operators.
So we are here to conduct some, research on site to look at, how our guests are telling us if they can give us more ideas on how we can welcome them back on the weekdays. We don't know what we don't know. So for them to tell us, we need to keep a very open mind to just hear from them.
When we approached them, we were just joking within the team that we felt a little bit like those interviewers or insurance agents at MRT station trying to sell them a product. Most of the guests that we met were really quite welcoming and quite friendly.
They are quite responsive to our feedback, and they do share a lot in terms of how their journey is like and what they are expecting.
Interesting answers that we get. Some of the answers I'm not really expecting that.
So yes, when we go beyond the surface, seeking to understand stories afresh and asking, observing, and listening fully to deeply understand people's views and perspectives, we can uncover likes, motivations, and pain points afresh, and then create truly inventive, exciting, and desirable ideas to take forward. I mean, as an example, who would be up to bringing your families to visit a beach more often if there were sandblasting facilities that kept your kids' fingers and toes extra clean? So empathy-based design research really allows us to understand people afresh. And there is a second part of design research, and that's user testing, that I'd like to share a little bit more about. Here's an example of a project we ran with an organization championing parenting, and they did a user test of a peer support group experience, and a few insights were discovered by the research team.
For me, I'm fascinated by the fact that you're also open so quickly. I would imagine some of the more personal one. Stephen, thank you also for being so open about sharing. Appreciate it. For me,
So they discovered that men love to talk, right? And unlike the conventional thinking that perhaps it's women who do more of the talking, and just really even very quickly being able to open up and share more challenging issues they were dealing with, right? And an idea for a brave man's club was seeded for the organization to take forward. So people are always changing, and empathy really serves to help us stay current, stay relevant in a way that other types of research might not be set out to uncover. Spending the time to ask open-ended, non-leading questions, observe people's behaviors, and conduct things remotely, conduct ethnographic studies remotely, and flow with the responses is one way. And here's an example again of how an openly crafted question, what did you not like about this experience, led to an unexpected answer.
Yeah.
What did you like the least?
Yeah.
To end the session.
a bit abrupt.
I think this should go on. There should not be any ending to this kind of things to motivate others to carry on.
So yes, I hope we can all start to see a little bit that design research and user testing, being human-centered and empathetic in how we go out there and engage people, research, can give us the courage to create new impact, the conviction that an idea does work, and the boldness to champion for it to happen, which is often the ingredient most needed for innovation. And even for challenges such as financial resilience of a social service organization, or reaching untapped audiences most needy of your support. These seemingly complex or messy topics are all within the reach of unpacking through an empathy-based design research. I'm happy to share a little bit more, at a breakout or Q&A around how to conduct experiential, conversational, and remote design research, how it looks like in practice. Even that's the end of my sharing. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Elias. And to move on from here, I would like to invite Muzang, who from WIS, who actually did a design project. And so maybe that can contextualize you to what a design project looks like for the social services. Over to you, Yana.
Okay. I thought I have to wait. Okay, can you see?
No.
No? Oh, okay. Let me try that again.
You must
try
the share screen below.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, IPS, for inviting Muiz to share this. Very excited to hear from all the three speakers. Kind of like flashback in my previous life when I think all of us here dabbled with a little bit of ABR, bits and pieces along the way. I like the fact that Elias reminded us again about disruption in behavior. For all of us here who are social work trained, there's a very basic approach, right? We're supposed to create dissonance so that change can happen. So I'm just excited to see all these connections, connecting the dots, and we'll definitely love to learn a lot more. So this is just going to be a short sharing about our design research, which was supported by IPS for our program called Leap Initiative. A little bit of background though, on our Empowerment Partnership Scheme, or EPS for short. Essentially, MUIS disburses supplementary Zakat financial assistance. When I say supplementary, meaning we expect all beneficiaries to still be connected to ComCare, right, at the national level. So part of the holistic approach was also to provide some form of program. So EPS was one of those that we kicked off a decade ago, over in 2004. So we're looking for profiles of families among our over 5,000 beneficiaries who are empowerable. So largely families with children, and we want to ease them out of the Zakat FE. This is also a formal step that we took in partnering with other SSAs, the social service agencies. On the get-go, we had 18 agencies, including FSCs. So essentially, we wanted to tap on the experts out there, right? Social workers, to be able to manage the casework portion of the program. So essentially, families come in, they have their ICP, individual care plan, that look at everything from the social, religious, educational needs, and look at employment and employability, and essentially take into consideration their struggles and all that, but prescribe some form of intervention through the agencies, but there are some prescribed KPIs of sorts, right? So that there was a training grant provided to facilitate employment, upskilling, educational needs of the children. We even support startup home-based businesses. And at the end of the program, families were graded, and there are cash incentives based on their gradings. And of course, the investment of the entire program also look into the admin fees that we have to share with the partner agency. So over a decade, over 1,000 families go through the program, and then we did our own internal review back in 2008 and somewhere in 2012. And again, that I said that the dissonance and discomfort, and again, we heard about yesterday and today, the evolution of evidence-based, and we wanted to see how we can review our program quite differently. So this is when we got IPS to come in, is that for an external, right, review of the entire program. So essentially, in a gist, what the observations of the findings through this both qualitative and quantitative review that we did over 2 years in 2017 and 2018 was that EPS was pretty much an FA casework kind of model, aimed at correcting the weaknesses of the clients. And there was huge stigma that was verbalized by the clients themselves, being part of the extended program. Not only are they FA client, but they're also part of it. Additional so-called intervention that are required to the EPS program. And there was very limited scope in terms of the delivery of the program, because it was largely dependent on the capacity of the relevant agencies in taking the family through their journey. And resources that was allocated was essentially a lot more wastage happened because we had attrition and all that. This highly prescriptive program was really looking from the individual's level kind of solution versus that from a structural lens, right? So the decision was made that the new program need to be radically innovative, right? Responding to all those gaps that we saw, it needs to prioritize the participant, ensure there's dignity in participation. There has to be diverse partners being able to come in and co-create the activities. And we also wanted to ensure that even within that interaction and that journey, that we could build community among the participants, because that was all those that were missing, and that's the gaps that were surfaced through the 5 batches over a decade that we conducted the programs. So one of the key things in moving the big steps was really leadership, right? The decision was made for us to be able to do this internally, we want to have better control of the outcome and the impact. And we had experienced the last batch for the EPS 5, where we actually piloted, we somewhat split the group into one that is managed by the agency and another group that was managed by our own internal resources, our own caseworkers. And then we saw that the difference in terms of the outcome. And we also wanted to be able to contribute to the larger literature in terms of supporting disadvantaged families. So that was one of the key things. And I want to echo some of the conversation we had in the morning on how the fact that support from management was very important. And on the get-go, we sought permission to fail. So that was very important for us, for the team who are not all research trained to be given that kind of space to be able to experiment, because this is a new social innovation that wasn't out there or simply new for MUIS, right? Because in the first place, MUIS is a step board, while we are the authority in Islamic and religious issues in Singapore. We don't necessarily do a lot of groundwork in terms of social development, right? So let me take you through very quickly on our design process. So question asked was, what should we focus on, right? Then how do we define our role? Then how do we measure outcome? And how can we bring in, more creative and in terms of future collaborations? What we decided on was really head on address all those concerns, right? So we said, okay, it's going to be pretty much client-centric. Okay, they get to choose, and and the program is going to be flexible. They get to define what goals, what would be important to them, all right? What programs or activities or challenges that will bring meaning and benefit them the most. So we really wanted to minimize the whole entire stigma. We say it's a journey, so you just do your own thing, on time, on target, OT. And we also wanted to be able to build social capital, because that the entire what casework could do was more of the facilitation in terms of bringing the families together. And we also wanted to provide an opportunity for them to pay it forward, all right, and to be assets of the community. Why is it in for us? So one of the buy-in, and then when we got management to really sit up, was really say, hey, unlike the previous model where everything is so prescriptive, we prepare everything for the family, regardless whether 10 families turn out or 25 families turn out, and then we pay this much, right? But now family choose their own journey, their goals that they set, so they're going to be no wastage, and there's also reduced staff to client ratio, because we are managing them in groups. The team of caseworker is managing the community of families. And there was opportunity for us to build capacity of the caseworker, because they're doing something else aside from just casework. And the flexibility in the program was something that we want to ensure and be able to tweak and expand as we move along. All right. And then the collaboration in designing into the system have to be built in that kind of openness on the get-go. And we were doing a lot more of the marketing and all that to ensure that potential and future partners, we did quite a bit of work in identifying all this and going out of the box to consider some of the partners that we never worked before, which includes some of these things that our previous speakers all talk about, people in the arts and all that. So of course, base of all this is TOC. So we look at, we go back to what will be key things that we want to be able to, the outcome and the impact, right? So we wanted to look at the individuals, and we also wanted to look at the families, and of course, financial empowerment. And last but not least, looking at how families can be assets of the community. So this TOC guide in terms of our program design. What we decided on was that we're going to approach it from a gamified perspective, whereby families will be able to unlock grants rather than grants being given to them to tap on, but family will actually clock in the activities and unlock grants through family challenges and community challenges. And through the journey, then they are able to strengthen family ties and be able to contribute back to the community through volunteer work as well. Okay, I'm pressing the wrong thing. So this is how the old EPS looked like, right? So there were grants are already made available for them, and then the ICP will take them through certain goals set together with the caseworker, and then they complete the program. For the new one, is quite different, right? Anybody who's interested, come in and just apply for the program. When I say anybody, means within our Zakat beneficiaries. So assessment is being made, and then we explain to them about the program, and then they learn the fact that you can unlock the grants through completion of challenges that you're clocking in hours, and the fact that they actually get to enjoy up to 5K of grant per family throughout the entire journey. So one of the things that we had to part of the capacity building was really identify the different work streams that we had to develop. The interesting part about this entire journey is that I think this is also one clear example where MUIS put together an inter-unit. So people from the strategic planning, people from the IT side, because we had an app developed for this. So there was a collaborative partnership even within the inter-units within MUIS. So we had different work streams. So we had one team that was just looking at designing the core and bonus challenges. We had one to just look at, like I said, finding all the partners, potential collaborators. And then we had a team that looked at the app to support the entire program. And another one that is tracking, and this would be the one from the strategic planning, the one that is the researchers in the team, and then another team that is looking at providing the support for the caseworkers, right? So we had 5 working teams all together when we on the get-go, with different timeline, and then at the same time we had to budget for all these various work. So the design process, of course, we aside from the research, we frame it from a DT, design thinking perspective. So just like how Elias mentioned, so we did our prototypes over 2 sessions, internal prototype and external prototype, and this is when we got our clients themselves to try out. We had the app, the whole entire process that gave us wonderful insights. We tweaked the program further between the internal and external prototype. We fine-tune and we actually record the entire process and journey. This entire experience was an eye-opening one, even for us as staff of MUIS, because we've never done this before, right? Being deeply involved in the design phase. Most often than not, MUIS will just outsource a lot of our programs. So, and then we, implemented. So we implement the program back in 2019. We call it LEAP Initiative. And this, we designed brochure. We told families, hey, you are in the driver's seat. You decide what you want to do. And we're just here going to be cheerleaders. We'll just support you in terms of your goal setting and then help you through. And at the same time, you want to be able to also connect you to each other, and then so that we can just thrive collectively. So that was the framing. And we told them that you are the best person to decide what would be good for your family. So that's a totally different kind of approach than our previous program. So this is how it looked like, right? So for every activity that the family go through, they accumulate hours, and then they unlocked it, and then they have that matching grants, right? So the more hours you clock in, then the more money that you can use to achieve your other goals, all right? But one interesting thing, if you look in the middle, is that reflection. So we have, so this is where we try to incorporate some of what the other presenters have mentioned about using, arts. So we have journaling incorporated in it, all right? So these are the 6 areas that we encourage family to work on. And I can't demo the app now because of too short a time. So just to show you how it looks like. So essentially, they go through, they set their family goes with their caseworker, then they clock in their hours, they journal about it. This just, and then they unlock their grants, all right? I'm just going to show you an example of some of the journals that was done. For example, this one, right? This we took it from, a family decide that she wants to do some home-based sewing, right? Then she set it out, and then the process. So this is what she, and then some other examples of some of our journals. family bonding, right? So family talk about the fact that now everybody is working from home and kids and all that. So how simple it is. And we told them that family activities need not be expensive, right? It can be cooking together, doing things together. The most important part is doing things together with your children. So these are some of the reflection. So this family talk about how easy it was to get. They didn't expect the children to be, excited about being involved in activities. And there's also the journal about signing up for an online reading program. So we get real-time info and data from families in terms of their journey. And when COVID hit, we also saw some of this reflection. Family was talking about how hard it was getting the pay card and all that. So there's enormous amount of data that we're getting from here. And just to share also, they will upload things like, okay, my husband have used the grant to go for some upskilling program, and then the fact that he managed to secure, this person eventually managed to secure a better job and then transit to better pay, right? And also there's journals about giving back to the community, joining some of the community-based programs, and even do some of the families even participating in some of the SMM duties, and signing up for other volunteer program during this period. So we saw that, and the most important thing is with the app, we also developed, I'm going to take a step back. So among the groups, we also developed, some of them have moved on and become mentors. So they coach the other families who are struggling, they help them through with some of their struggles, and they become the bridge between the caseworkers and the families of sorts, right? So the fact that we have 19 mentors out of our 40 families. So what we have done quite differently is also to reduce the number, right? Previously, batches would have been an average of 200 families, but this time around we only had 60 families, and then eventually 40 completed the program. We lost quite a sizable number when COVID hit, and families couldn't continue to commit, but eventually 40 of them, and then 19 of them are mentors. So what we saw was, because we have an app, right, where the community continue to interact. So it was very easy for us to transit from F2F, face-to-face, to just online programming. And after a while, we also got mentors themselves to conduct some of the engagement. So what you see here are really check-in sessions. These are caseworker checking in with the families, because we do put in some of this essentially, a bit more of the flow up in regards to how families are doing by the caseworkers themselves. But a lot of time we let them run the program themselves. Now we've come to a stage where the mentors are co-creating the engagement and all that. We are at the tail end of the program. So some families have completed, and then some we are allowing the rest to just finish off by the end of the month. And yeah, so that's it. But one takeaway was that I think it took courage from the team, a lot of support from management, leadership. Our CE was brave enough to support us. This is a $500,000 investment, 100,000+ on building the apps. So I think you need all this aligned, where the stars are aligned for things to happen. Yeah, and we were lucky to be able to embark on this, and we'll be already rolling out our batch 2. So this is our pilot, and then we're already in the tweaking and like looking at how we can make the app more user-friendly, how to make it easier for families, the entire family, to navigate the program, and where they can journey as community also, because right now we're also looking at how can we accommodate them. We're talking about those that have completed the program and come back as alumni. Yeah. Okay, that's it, Justin.
Thank you so much, Yana. This is such a great example of how you can actually totally redesign the financial assistance program into something like a family challenge that you meaningfully do. I was sitting in one of the pro diving sessions, and this remark always stuck in my mind, because they were encouraging these families to contribute back, maybe, and because it was Muay, so they're thinking, oh, contribute back to the Malay Muslim community. So one of them said, can we actually contribute back by volunteering and contribute back to the larger Singaporean society rather than just the Malay Muslim community? And that gave me goosebumps, right? So that, I mean, they were even more generous in my mind. And I would like to move on to Hannah, then we'll go to breakout rooms. Hannah, over to you, please.
Thanks, Justin. Gosh, yes. So much has already been shared. I don't know what else I could discuss. And also I'm mindful of the time, so I'll try and keep it short and not and let everyone go to the breakout session. So I'd like to touch on the arts-based participatory research as well, co-producing. I don't have any presentation, so I'm just going to discuss it off the top of my head. Based on my experience, previous experience, and also current experience in participatory research and also arts-based research. So as we know, arts-based research, or ABR for short, it's a field of research that's really varied, right? So it covers all aspects and forms of arts practice that is related to research. But frequently, the point of arts-based research is more so in Singapore especially, is not to answer questions or offer final meanings or findings, but rather to invoke or provoke more questioning or deepen engagement, right? Open debate, inspire social action. It's used to broaden engagement to effect change. And it provokes like different ways of thinking and seeing. So it engages audiences and it evokes like emotional reactions, right? Which journal articles won't be able to do, well, maybe except to like induce boredom. So the best example that I can give of arts-based research within the Singapore context, although these are essentially arts-based community development projects, but could easily be arts-based participatory action research, because like Sarah said before, the difference really is the intention, right? Whether you collect intentionally the data when you start or not. And the best examples are Arts Walk Collaboratives, Both Sides Now project, which is a performative arts theatre, participatory theatre project talking about end-of-life issues. And also I'd like to point out Three Pumpkins Tak Takut Club, where it's a neighborhood community project where it uses arts and play to engage with children and young people in the neighborhood. So in this, so these arts-based methodologies and methods, so they allow for creative expression, right? So it allows us to obtain knowledge that may otherwise remain obscure or too taboo or too sensitive to talk about. And to gain better access to the emotional embodied realms of life, right? To cultivate empathy, that was mentioned, and also to challenge and provoke audiences to think about things, you know, different lens, to see things from different worldviews and lenses, and to engage with complex, you know, difficult social issues. So with that, I mean, with those, there are lots of positives with arts-based research, and but I'd like to raise a few issues that comes along with the approach of arts-based as well, especially in engaging with complex and difficult social issues, or really in its approach in understanding human condition, situations, circumstances, and invoking or embodying human emotions, right? And Patricia mentioned the various art forms that you could use in arts-based research, and it has varying complexities, right? From and varying complexity and demands of embodiment, and it lies on a continuum. Right. I'm a big proponent of arts-based research, but I'd like to offer 3 key points on top of confidentiality, informed consent challenges that are present in all research projects. And these points essentially ask more questions rather than providing answers. The first one is, so the 3 key points are representation, aesthetics or ownership, and also emotional risks when it comes to especially arts-based approach to research. So in representation in arts-based research, so whose story is it anyway? We talk about, right? This relates to ownership. We'll talk about a little bit more later. And how much discretion should be given to the artists or the facilitators to select which story they want to centralize, for example? Like, let's say it's in the in a theater production, right? So what is the central story? Whose central story are we doing? How do we package the message? Who packages the message that we want to perform? How would it be dramatized, for example, right? And does that selection process allow research participants to challenge how the message is interpreted, and how true is the end product in relation to the messages that research participants has given during the research, right? And how do we deal with different interpretations of the very same data by the artists, researchers, participants, and so on? So that's a question of representation. Who decides and how? The second one is aesthetics and ownership. So especially when one is co-producing in arts-based research, right? So what about the aesthetics? So what is counted as good arts-based research output, right? And who gets to determine what's good? And good for whom? And from what perspective? And as for ownership, we go back to the question of whose story is it anyway? So who ultimately owns the work? So for example, let's say in an arts-based research where you have a piece of spoken word that was written by and performed by a research participant. So the manuscript of that spoken word is owned by the participant or the researcher, or so who owns that piece of art? And for photographs, and in which format, who owns them? So those are other questions that I'm asking. So that leads to like ownership of the research process as well, right? So all that would need to be, I think, addressed at the beginning of the research process, especially in research projects such as arts-based research, or especially research where you have co-production, and participatory research is where there are blurred lines, and where you want to, your intention is to create ownership, but in the end, ownership in what form, in what manner, at what level? So who owns the research output, right? So we need to ask that. The third point that I'd like to raise is emotional risk. So asking people to participate in communicating their issues in a more embodied and representational manner that process can result in uncomfortable or unexpected feelings. And what happens then? The facilitators, trainers, researchers trained enough, for example, if if an incident happened where research participants trigger warning gets re-traumatized during the process, right? How does one then deal or handle such incidents? So because the arts open up the participants, audience, viewers, and readers to emotional moments, right? And feelings enter into the work. So we would need to be more careful as well in our approach. So in being careful as well, we did mention that it's arts-based approach is accessible, everyone can do it, but how you do it is important, right? And who is involved is also important, because there are issues, especially when dealing with sensitive issues, taboo topics, where one participant may get into situations where they get triggered, or they get where the approach may actually create more trauma than catharsis, for example, in the process. So it has potential for participants to find it troubling, unsettling, even disturbing at times, right? What are the ways that and how should we conduct the research in order to circumvent or reduce the emotional risk involved in that? And also there is also the main peril when I look at arts-based research, in my experience when conducting arts-based research as well, is also the arts-based participatory research, mostly that I've conducted, is the problem of the paradox between liberation and tyranny of participation. Okay, where you would like the process to be as participatory as possible, but then you are faced with time constraints, funding issues, and also KPIs brought upon by the funders and the organizations that ask you to do those research. So I have come across facilitators, researchers having tempted to forego active participation and decision making because it was taking too long, right? Or in other contexts, in an arts-based context, in participatory theatre, the facilitators took control of the direction of the production so that they could control the outcome of the quality of the production, right? So that they could meet the stated KPIs from the organizations. So that is also on the flip side of the liberation of participation is the tyranny of participation. That's another point that I'd like to point out. So what is needed? I think the two most important components in whether it be arts-based research, empathy-based research, or participatory research is researcher reflexivity and flexibility, right? And to have constant and critical reflexivity and flexibility becomes essential components, not only on the part of the researcher, but also other essential stakeholders such as funders and organizations. So the onus should not only be on the researcher, because a lot of times researchers' hands are tied because of other stakeholders, right? So we would need to talk about that as well. Like they, funders and organizations who, runs these research has to take the responsibility to be reflexive and flexible as well. Last point, Justin, arts-based and participatory, though there are many positives in their approaches, they are not necessarily trauma-informed or equity-centered. So those are also very important components, which I feel needs to be embedded within the research approach, but that's a whole other session or conference. So I shall end here and hand over the time back to you.
Thank you, Hannah. Because Elias has to go at 5, we're deciding to split the breakout sessions into 2. So one will be with Elias and Luciana. So it will be about the design and the participatory research, and with Sarah Banks, and then the other one would be arts-based research. And so we're hoping that you come back maybe, we'll inform you when to come back, but it'll be 2 sessions. And so you can go down to your Zoom and choose the breakout rooms you want to be in, whether you want to talk about arts-based research or design/participatory research. And thanks everyone for coming back to the main session. I will do a quick closing and then we'll do feedback forms. If you missed the first 2 panels, then I'm not really trying to summarize. I'm trying to share what were my own kind of take-home points for these for the three sessions. So I think what I'll do here is I'll take liberties to overstate my points a little, just so as to see with greater clarity for myself. And I will dispense with caveats and exceptions and all sorts of considerations. And it's not that I'm not aware of them. I feel that if sometimes you need to overstate the point to be clear what you're trying to say. And so I also find that analysis that is any good always takes some kind of a risk. And if you don't, then there won't be anything worth saying because there's nothing surprising about it. And so a lot of people in non-profit sector like to talk about thought leadership. This is not my thought leadership. This is just me being bossy and liking to tell people how to think. So if I had to figure out what were some of the take-home points for the whole conference, it is that evaluation isn't everything. And we have a fetish for evaluation that perhaps we need to get over. And there was a lot of discussion about whether certain programs were even evaluatable in the first place. And then, of course, finding the right size evaluation for the programs which are at different life stages. You don't always have to have that outcome evaluation. And lots of smaller or light touch evaluations can allow for learning improvement just as well. I also found that the first thing you usually care about should be one of the last things that you care about. And these are the metrics or the indicators. Every time people talk about evaluating a program, they go straight to what are the most rigorous indicators or scales we can use. And as we've heard from the speakers, that's really the last thing. The first thing you care about is, well, the logic of evaluation is what is the criteria of evaluation you want to choose? And then what kind of outcomes do you care about? And what is the theory of change? How is everything that you're doing supposed to add up? And only after you figure all that out, then you say, okay, since these are the meaningful things to measure, these are some of the metrics and measures we can use. And that's usually one of the last things you care about. I also found that the part of the evaluation that you usually don't care about should be one of the most important things you attend to. And most of the speakers acknowledge that values are at play, who gets to define what counts as success, and choosing the criteria of evaluation. Because focusing even on measures or indicators, a certain group of measures or indicators, already imply that a certain choice is made, and certain ways of defining success is already implicit in the choice of the measure. So it's much better to be explicit about your values and about what counts as success, and getting different stakeholders' views on that, including your communities and clients who usually don't have a seat at the table making such decisions, before deciding how to evaluate. So this is particularly important to attend to, I feel. And in relation to that, we've learned that research isn't neutral and evidence isn't context-free. And while research and science adopts a kind of technical language that makes you think it is neutral and impartial, there are always values at play. And power and professional self-interest shape what counts as evidence, who can produce evidence, and how they should go about producing it. And we just heard from Sarah, and it occurs to me that, you know, if you are a practitioner on the ground and you hear from your community that this is their problem, that is their problem, in the orthodox view, this is anecdotes. This is what you hear, this hearsay, you know, that's not evidence. Only when someone with the credentials to scope and design a research study, researcher, then they apply for IRB, clear ethics, and then, you know, they hire research assistants, they go out and interview people, document what they say, and then analyze it, and then they publish a report, and only when it gets published in a journal article, oh, suddenly what is being said counts as credible evidence. And so there is that at play, and I've heard from various professionals that, you know, as long as I hear from my clients that this is what they're going through, that is good enough evidence for me. So it's useful to keep in mind that what counts as evidence isn't something self-evident. And in the business of doing or using research, it seems that according to Howard White's presentation, perhaps you should become really good at using evidence first before you even consider getting into the business of evidence production, right? Most nonprofits are small, cannot afford specialists or experts to do research, which some of it will be really quite difficult. So why not become really good at using the research? So instead of hiring researchers, perhaps you should be thinking about working with knowledge brokers, people who know how to access evidence portals and read systematic reviews, rather than hiring researchers to do research. But it's just, you know, I'm just overstating the point, right? Of course, there's a role for all these things. Perhaps try new models of partnership that is more demand-centric than supply-driven. A lot of the, and what that means is that a lot of the work from the people who produce research has been trying to make it easier to push it down, make it accessible, readable, understandable to the practitioners to absorb it. And that's supply driven, right? You come up with evidence-based clearinghouses and evidence platforms and reviews that are readable, and then you try to push it towards the practitioners. There are new models that Hugh Davis have kind of highlighted, which starts from the demand, right? Starts from the practitioners' context. And so I'm particularly interested in this concept of the embedded research. It's kind of like the artist in residence concept, whereby you have a researcher, and the researcher gets posted to a nonprofit and sits there for a year or two, and then offers his service. And so all his research and evaluation expertise will be in service of the organizations or the programmatic outcomes, rather than the other way around. I've also learned that it's important to be open to diverse vantage points on what counts as evidence and diverse approaches to generating evidence. For example, co-produce research where possible. Try arts-based approaches to see what unique values they bring. And if you want to do research, consider investing in solutioning forms of research, right? Evaluation isn't everything. I figured from my own point of view that instead of ever more rigorous evaluations of the same tired interventions, why not focus on creating new solutions and innovations that make evaluations even worthwhile in the first place? So that's my quick sharing. Any comments or reflections from anybody before I give the floor back to the speakers for your closing reflections? If not, can we hear from Sarah? Any parting thoughts for us on the conversation you had today and what you brought back from it?
Well, thank you. It's been an honor for me to be here with you today, and I found it very, very interesting to hear from the other speakers and to hear from the participants about what you're doing there in Singapore. And I think there's a lot of very exciting developments. And it's hard for me to comment from so many thousand miles away to try and compare, but I do think that you have a lot of skills and talent there, and I wish you all the best in your future developments in the non-profit organizations, because I think the key to our future world lies with local people in local areas, in interest groups, actually trying to work themselves to change the situation they're in. Obviously, it's hard depending on what sort of government you have, what sort of structures you have to work against and within, and different countries have different barriers. But I do think, you know, we've got a real issue now with global warming, climate change, huge inequalities, huge health problems worldwide, and we do need to start with local people and people experiencing problems and issues themselves. And the NPOs, I think, are uniquely placed. They know what's going on the ground and can play a huge role. So I wish you well in Singapore in your endeavours over the next year, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, and we appreciate you making the time for us. Patricia, are you still there? Do you have any parting reflections for us?
Yes, I am here, and I just want to echo what Sarah said. This was such an enriching conversation, and I took a few notes. You know, it wasn't until I listened to the other panelists in the session that I realized how brilliant you were in curating this panel, because there were such connections. Although we were speaking about different things in some ways, in other ways, I think we're all talking about the same thing. So some of the things that came up in all of our presentations were this idea of a more human approach to research, the idea that empathy is an important part of the research process, the issues and challenges and benefits of working together across differences. And finally, we all talked about the messiness of doing meaningful research. And I say meaningful research because sure, there's some research you can do that maybe won't be messy and it'll be cookie cutter and neat and organized, but it's not always the really meaningful, grassroots, important, impactful research. So I think that it's important to embrace that messiness when you go out and develop your own projects. And so I'd just like to thank you and all the conference organizers for having me. It's been a wonderful conversation, and thank you to the participants for your time. I really enjoyed speaking with all of you.
Thank you so much. And I will note down the brilliant curating of the panel and report that to our funder. Hannah, do you have any reflections for us?
Yes, just one on, like you said, like Patricia said, to build on what she said as well, the being human, do things right by the participants. And there are many ways where how we can conduct research, but the main thing is to do what it takes to do right by the people we work with.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Muzayana, I think a lot of people were fans of the program that you shared, and I think they're really keen to find out more. So we'd be glad to see if you can share some more in the future. Do you have any parting comments for us? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm so glad that I'm probably gonna have, I will make a lot more friends here and bring you on board in case the new leadership that's coming in will probably challenge some of the freedom and flexibility that we have enjoyed. And I would love to see imagined that Sarah mentioned about happen in Singapore. I mean, next month, I think the next SSR sharing is already talking about, ABR again. I thought what big change that I want to touch again about the courage and advocacy, right? I think for the teams who have gone through the experience, then, come together and continue that discipline or, that fighting spirit, regardless of the changing leadership or issues with funding. I think it's important for us because then we be the walk the talk, right? Evidence that we can commit. So it's not just an exercise that we stumble upon and just this group of, but then try to create ripples within the organization, right? In terms of how the diverse groups, we came in with different expertise. I thought that was a big learning point for us. We talk about it all the time. But seeing it happen, that we brought in diverse group, and then now it becomes somehow like a second nature for us, right? Before we do anything, the evaluation process have to be embedded during the design. It's not like an afterthought, it's not just, like I said, the ROIs, the KPI. We found our voices, we challenged certain position that management perhaps might still take, or individuals, and then is also getting the buy-in, relationship building, even with the bosses. I even had, for example, took time to speak to individuals, just take them aside and say, why you need to give us a chance, So if we need to, then do that, whether it's at an individual level, leverage on our own relationship that we have with the different bosses, definitely stakeholders. I think one of the things that we leverage on in terms of, because right now we are piloting this program with the Malay Muslim community, right, is that position that we enjoy right now, as MUIs. So in getting families or participants, they enjoy that process of being part of that, being consulted, being part of their journey. So I think this is where I have to give credit. I say we learn a lot from the other agencies, and I have to say thank you to Gerard and beyond. We had lots of learning journeys to also other agencies, and then this is where we understood that we have to quickly make friends and continue this collaborative partnership. And I really hope that definitely all of us will continue talking to each other and find courage to push on and get excited and believe that all of us are experts in one way or another in contributing to meaningful research. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yana. And with that, that's the conclusion of the panel. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a good day.